First of all, I'd like to thank the guests for attending this water legislation forum. The DFL Environmental Caucus is fairly active at trying to promote legislation, promote candidates who are favorable to environmental issues and such. And this is, I don't know, maybe the fourth or so of two in water. This will be a second for water, and we've had several in energy and a couple of other topics, and they generally work out fairly well. A few notes to the audience first. We'll have an open chat, so raise your hand. If you haven't done that, go down to the reactions bar off to the right on the bottom of your screen. You push that, and then you, then you raise your hand, and I'll see your hand, and just wait for a while, and we'll call on you then. At least in the beginning, let's not just start talking without raising our hands. And also, for those of you who are quieter or have poor connections or just have a thought that you're not quite ready to articulate in words, but ready to write down, use the chat feature, which is dead square at the bottom. It's a little like when people talk, they have the little, whatever those circles are called. And you can write a chat. And if you want to send it to everyone, send it to everyone. Greg and Megan will be directing summarizing the chat questions and such, and asking them orally. So we may put several together, depends how many we get, or put it in. There's a separate Q&A written section that also goes under reactions, and so you now you can ask questions orally, or you have two ways to ask questions in writing. We'll try to get to everything. I'm pretty sure we will be able to get to everything. So with that, I'd like to introduce the three speakers, panelists. Peter Fischer, he's a legislator from 44A, and that's roughly, as you go up 35E, both sides, and all the way, almost not quite across the river, but getting there. Has been a legislator in his sixth term, and is on the water subcommittee. That some of you have attended a session with Jim Stark a while back. Jim and Peter know each other very well. And the second guest is Paul Gardner. He's the administrator currently for the Clean Water Council and a former legislator, so is very tuned in to a lot of the legislative things. Let me just point out a little bit of a connection here. We heard from Jim Stark, who is the administrator for the subcommittee on water policy, of which Peter is a member, and the other group is the Clean Water Council. Both are fairly important institutions in water policy in this state, or very important in water policy. And so the three of these guys know each other fairly well, I think. Jim and Peter and Paul. Paul, let's see. I'm sorry, I said you're a former legislator, and Carly is fairly new to the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and she's the water program director. She has she's a PhD candidate. So since you're here, I take it that to mean you're all but dissertation, but has expertise in water and mineral resources. And is I think really a contribution to MCA. And I'd like each of you guys, if you give some opening statements in about that order, Peter, Paul, and then Carly. What are some of your top issues, and what generally speaking, at least at this point, what are the ways that the audience can participate and have some influence and be most effective on those? If you want to mention specific bills, that's fine, but if not, we'll talk about those a little bit later. But Peter, could you start with that? You're muted.
Sure, I can. Thank you. Thank you, Larry, for having us here today. There's, as you mentioned, we've got a number of bills out there. Probably the first place I would start is making sure that we get the Legislative Water Commission reestablished. That is something we had brought back, Senator Uyghur and I brought back about 10 years ago, and it had a sunset on it. And unfortunately, we had divided government who can never get through to get the sunset removed. So it became a subcommittee. And so we'd like to be able to go from subcommittee to being a regular full-fledged commission again, without the end date on, so that we can keep on doing the work, because there's so much work that needs to be done in addressing water issues, because the water issues that we have in our state look so different depending what parts of the state you are. In some parts of the state, if you go into northern Minnesota, they've got so much water, they have troubles trying to drain it out of the way. And so that's why we have a lot of ditches up in that area so that they can farm the land up there. You get to the southwest part of the state, they have so little water that they're piping in water from the Missouri River. So you kind of go through everything in between, and then we have the issues where in most parts of the state, we use groundwater, and it's not unusual that in many instances we have issues with our groundwater. In certain areas, nitrogen and pesticides are a problem in it. In other areas, contaminations from historical landfills have caused problems. Down here in the East Metro, we've got two problems hitting us. We've got the problems with the PFAS contamination in a large area of water covering Lake Elmo, Oakdale, parts of Maplewood, down into Woodbury, down into Cottage Grove. And at the same time, we've got the issue up here in White Bear Lake, where in this area, where we are using groundwater at a rate that is no longer sustainable. And the way we can see that is because the level of White Bear Lake no longer follows the historical patterns as it has of precipitation in the past, but it is now following different patterns. And it seems we crossed the line somewhere between 3 billion and 4 billion gallons of being pumped out of the aquifer in the area. Currently, the amount of pumping out of the aquifer is around 6 billion gallons. And so there's been lawsuits on that, and it's trying to figure out how to balance that out, how to balance out the needs of the communities that have contaminated aquifers. And so that's some of the things that I have worked on over the last 10 years. There is some legislation out there right now that Senator Seeberger in the Senate is carrying. It was heard last week. Representative Brian Curran, who just came in the White Bear Lake area, is carrying it in the House. And what that would do is that would set up a process so that over the next 4 years, it would bring the communities together to figure out, we're using too much water out of the aquifer. How do we figure out who uses surface water, or how do we start using surface water in the region to start cutting back on the amount of surface water in that region? On top of that, we have places like Lake Elmo that have growth mandates on it by the Met Council. And as a result, they need to be adding additional water usage to be able to meet those growth demands. Unfortunately, because of groundwater contamination, most of the aquifers that they have access to are contaminated. And at the same time, the only places that can find to bring in surface or aquifer water, it'd be from partnerships with with Oakdale or some of those places that are already covered by the court cases dealing with White Bear Lake. And as a result, the DNR will no longer issue permits to Lake Elmo. So we're trying to work through that process so that we can figure out how do we bring water out to those who need it to allow development to occur. So that's one set of problems that we're dealing with out there. In addition, the other set of problems that we're trying to deal with, and I've got a bill on that's House File 1390, and what it is trying to come up with a statewide plan for safe drinking water. And part of the problems that we have, as I mentioned, is that besides what I mentioned in the East Metro, we have a number of other areas in the different parts of the state where we have had contamination coming in with high nitrates in a lot of areas where agriculture is present. And typically that also means, besides having high nitrates, which is well above the health department thresholds, it's not unusual that you might find pesticides or pesticides remnants in it. So it's trying to figure out how do we address that, not only on the public water system, but we have a lot of private wells out there, and a lot of places don't test the private wells. And so they may be unwittingly drinking water that is not healthy for them. So it's trying to build out a system to address that problem. This has shown itself to be pretty you can have pretty quick impacts on it in certain parts of the state. And what I will use is in southeastern Minnesota, it is called what is the karst region, where the ground is very porous and it does not take long for water falling on the ground to be into the aquifer that people are pumping out of, the top aquifers. And what that means is it's not unusual that after heavy rain, you can find that water starting to enter under the underground aquifer as quickly as within a handful of hours, and within a couple of days for sure it is moving through. And one of the problems that means is a lot of times when they run off, you have instances where it's carrying the pesticides or the nitrogen off with it. And so these are ending up in the aquifer, and it moves very quickly, but that means that somebody has a private well in the area, they don't realize if they're taking in those contaminants. To give you an idea how bad those contaminants have been, is we've had a problem with fish kills down in that region of the state. Is after large rainfalls, is that we'll have a lot of fish that will start dying off in the creeks, and these creeks, several of them are fed directly our groundwater that's coming out from the bluffs. And so as a result, that's telling you if you're having that problem with the creeks, that means you've got that problem in the aquifer. The good news is because it moves so quick, it does not take long to clean out the aquifer. And we've seen that in some areas in the karst region, where they will develop what are called wellhead protection areas. So if you've got a public drinking water supply, they have to have a large area around those well fields that they have for the communities, where you have to make sure that you don't have intensive farming going on or anything that can pollute the water. And in several of the instances where they've established those and they've cleaned up the landscape on the top, they have found within a year or two, all of a sudden you find a dramatic difference in the amount of nitrogen that you're finding in the groundwater. So it proves that those methods can be very effective at helping clean up the water. But at the same time, it also shows how quickly and how much of an impact that farming does have on our underlying water system. The other thing that we're also looking at is making sure that we continue following up on the recommendations, or a large number of recommendations that came out of the subcommittee on water. I have about a dozen of those that I've introduced to the House that we're slowly working on. The problem is there are so many bills that have been introduced in the Environment Committee that we are not able to get those all heard at this point in time, and a number of them are probably going to have to wait till next year. But the big ones we're trying to focus on this year is getting the Legislative Water Commission reestablished, putting together the group that will work with getting money allocated to bring together all the communities in the East Metro together to figure out how do you allocate the groundwater out there in such a way that it's used sustainably, and at the same time build out a system that will bring in additional surface water to meet the community's growing needs. And then finally working on the what I call House File 1390 of doing a lot of work on the health waters, making sure we're taking a look at what's being done, what is contaminated, making sure that it's being keeping it portable and drinkable, and doing that kind of work. And at that point, I will stop, because I could easily go on for another hour or so on water issues.
Okay, good, thanks. That's like a good start. And let's hold questions for a few minutes here. Paul, could you give us your top priority? First of all, what tell us a little bit about the Clean Water Council while we get started, because I'm not sure everybody knows.
I assume my audio is doing just fine.
Your audio is, yeah, it's more or less fine. Yeah.
Okay. If there's a problem, let me know and I'll unplug. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a Sunday night. I know you wanted to get all your red carpet coverage for the Oscars this evening, but instead you're here online with the Environmental Caucus. Thanks for what you do in maintaining interest. I remember when I was a college student in the late 80s, caucusing in Iowa, we couldn't get anyone interested in using environment as a political organizing tool, and now it's just overflowing now. It's great. So my name is Paul Gardner. I'm the administrator for the Clean Water Council in Minnesota. The Clean Water Council is a state advisory council that was set up as part of the Clean Water Legacy Act in 2006. And that legislation addresses how we identify and address impairments to our surface waters and our groundwater, and is designed to help protect drinking water sources. I was a DFL state legislator from Shoreview. I represented parts of Shoreview, North Oaks, Lino Lakes, Blaine, and all of Lexington and Circle Pines. That district has been redrawn several times, but the person I beat to get in there was on the Sierra Club's list of toxic 12 legislators. So that was enjoyable. I worked in recycling and solid waste for about 20 years, and some in water before, and now I've been in this job for more than 4 years, so actually longer than I've been a legislator. I am a state employee, just to let you know. I am an employee of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. They didn't quite know where to put me, so that's where they put me, and I have a cubicle by the copy machine on the 6th floor. So I don't fit neatly within the hierarchy. But the Clean Water Council is a group of 28 members. There are 17 members who may vote on any recommendations for policy or funding. They are described in statute to represent certain constituencies. So we have folks from local government, farm organizations, business organizations, environmental groups, and the like. And then we have 11 other members, including the university, 4 legislators, and 6 state agencies. The major task that the council has had since 2009, since the ratification of the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, has been the recommendation on how to use the Clean Water Fund, which is 1/3 of the revenue derived from the increased sales tax created by the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. I have discovered that a lot of audiences that I talk to sometimes are there are more and more people who weren't old enough to vote in 2008, and so reminding people of why that is always important, or people weren't in the state. That amendment only lasts for 25 years. That's the good news, is it lasts for 25 years, but it's not perpetual. We have assumed on the Clean Water Council that we should just plan for expiration without renewal, which helps us identify the things we would like to accomplish by 2034. We don't spend a lot of time on stuff where you need a permit. So things that are generally regulated by the Clean Water Act, because it was determined in the mid-2000s that we didn't have enough money with existing funds to address non-point sources, among other things. And even to meet certain obligations set by the EPA for monitoring our waters and determining impaired waters, and then writing total maximum daily load reports for each one of those impaired waters. So the Clean Water Fund has given us dollars that we to fund things that we couldn't do otherwise. We spend about 15% on monitoring our waters to figure out what's wrong with our waters, if anything. If there is something wrong, we also then try to find the source of the problem with those dollars, come up with a plan to fix the waters, or restore them, as we call it, then funding a fix, and then monitoring the fix itself to see if it worked. We use the same logic with drinking water sources, both surface and groundwater sources. By 2034, we'll have a whole myriad of activities that will help, I wouldn't say ensure, but vastly reduce the risk to drinking water sources by 2034. The time it takes to actually get stuff off the impaired waters list can take 10 years to 15 years from the time of initial detection to the time you might take them off the impaired waters list. We are dealing with land use and trying to not only figure out where the problems are, but what the sources are, and then engage landowners in particular on things that they can do to improve the situation. It's time consuming, but it also can be rewarding. We're finding now, as we're talking about climate, that the things that we can do to combat certain contaminants in our water, like nitrates, happen to be things that are good for climate, as well as other tasks, including farmer profitability and climate resilience. So we get some multiple benefits out of those activities. I'll just end to mention that we do have some, or I'll mention some of the bills we're tracking. So one of them, obviously, is the recommendations by the Clean Water Council for using what is now going to be $318 million over 2 years. It's always fun to present to other states, and they get kind of upset because we have these resources that they're kind of jealous of. I shouldn't be so dismissive of other states, but it is an amazing resource. But there's a couple of new things that we're proposing. One is that every private well owner in the state over the course of 10 years would have the opportunity to test for 5 major contaminants in their well water. We did a pilot program to figure out what that would take, and then Representative Patty Acom introduced a bill that caused us to figure out what that would cost, and we inserted in the recommendations. We also will have ongoing monitoring for PFAS in our rivers, lakes, and fish, and also give more capacity to the health department to set up health-based guidance for PFAS in water for a variety of compounds. They're just backed up in a big way. So those are 3 of the key highlights. There are more. You can always Google us at Minnesota Clean Water Council, and you'll find our website as well as our most recent recommendations, which I think is 40 pages or so. Also lists the rationale for how we spend the money in what I hope is a more understandable way than we've done in the past. So Larry, I'll stop there and can hand it off to Carly. It's Peter, Paul, and Carly. It's a mashup of several 70s groups there.
I actually took a Uber the other day, and the driver started to play Sweet Caroline as soon as I got into the car. So, so thank you very much for the invitation to join you all today. I really appreciate it. As Larry said, I myself am definitely the newest of the group of guest speakers, both to the state and to environmental work with the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And I'm not a former legislator. So those are the 2 pieces that set me apart tonight. But I'm very grateful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I did prepare a presentation. I am recently escaped from academia, so I am trained to prepare PowerPoint presentations anytime I give a talk. I don't know if would it be helpful to go ahead and share those slides? There are some images that might be helpful.
Absolutely. Let me just make you co-host.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, there you go, Carly. You should be all
Okay.
set.
Thanks. All right. Okay, can you see my screen? Yes, okay, thanks.
Yes.
All right, so I will first give a very brief introduction of the organization that I work with, the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. So we are an environmental law nonprofit. And our mission is to use law and science to protect Minnesota's environment, its natural resources, and the health of its people. So for nearly 50 years, next year is our 50th anniversary, we've worked in the courts. So a large part of our staff is staff attorneys at the legislature, and also directly with public agencies to enact, strengthen, and enforce smart environmental law. We have 4 different program areas. So we have a water program, and I'm the water program director. We also have a climate and energy program, a Northeastern Minnesota program, which is largely focused on mines, and then also a healthy communities program. That is our newest program area, and it is more focused on issues of urban and environmental justice. So I joined the organization as the water program director in October of 2022. And I come out of a PhD research background and worked at an environmental law nonprofit in Madison, Wisconsin before I came to Minnesota. So I want to give you an overview of some of the key issues that we work with in the water program. I will mention a few specific pieces of legislation, but I won't go into too much detail, and then we can dive into those further if they come up in discussion, the question and answer portion. So I want to show you these maps to start with. So one of the areas that we work really closely with in the MCEA water program is agricultural drainage. So agricultural drainage refers to both surface ditches and subsurface tile that have been installed to transform Minnesota's wet, marshy landscape into productive cropland since statehood. So since 1858, that's when our first drainage law was passed. And drainage systems have converted over 90% of our wetland landscapes into cropland, especially in the southern and western parts of the state. So what you can see in these maps is hydric soil distribution, which is a type of soil that indicates the presence of wetlands from the 1860s on the left to 1981 on the right. So you can see the dramatic transformation there. But this is not just a problem in the past. I want to emphasize that, you know, our first drainage law was 1858, and a lot of drainage activity happened in the late 19th and early 20th century, but it's a problem that continues today. So over the past 10 years, tile drain lands have actually increased by over 25% in the state. And this is largely in part, not largely because of the need to both repair or increase the hydraulic capacity of drainage systems because of the increased intensity and frequency of precipitation events from climate change. So I do want to mention a specific bill here, which is House File 2354. The House author is Representative Purcell. This was heard in the House Environment and Natural Resources Committee this past week. And the interest here is to address the fact that our current public notice requirements for drainage systems limit mandatory notice to the benefited property owners for a particular drainage system, as well as those in the immediate jurisdiction of what's called a local drainage authority. So under Minnesota drainage law, drainage systems are administered by a county or a watershed district, and that's what's referred to as a local drainage authority. So our mandatory public notice is limited to people in the immediate jurisdiction of these drainage authorities. However, we now know definitively at this point that the cumulative impact of drainage systems has fundamentally altered the hydrology of many of our public waters in ways that have led to increased erosion and downstream floods, increased nutrient loads from cropland runoff, and the destruction of thousands of acres of wetlands along with their critical ecosystem functions. And because of these impacts of public resources, in the water program, we think it's important to have a centralized statewide database where the broader public, downstream landowners, local governments, tribal nations, and regulatory agencies can learn about new proposed drainage projects. So that's the content of this particular bill, which I'm happy to talk about further if people are interested. Then this came up in Representative Fischer's comments also, but another area of focus for us in the water program is surface and groundwater contamination from agricultural sources of pollution. And we are particularly concerned about the severity of surface and groundwater contamination in the Minnesota karst. So this diagram shows why the Minnesota karst aquifers are so susceptible to pollution and so sensitive to land management practices at the surface. Basically, what you have is a very thin layer of topsoil, and then you have highly erodible limestone bedrock, and then the sandstone is beneath the limestone. So as Representative Fischer mentioned, when you have precipitation on the surface, that precipitation will pick up whatever has been land applied at the surface. So, you know, you see a crop field in the corner of this diagram. So manure land application, pesticides, nitrate fertilizer, it'll pick all of that up and very, very quickly, within hours, carry it into the more shallow underground aquifers. And then there's recharge between the deeper underground aquifers and the shallow aquifers. So sources of contamination are shared that way also. And, you know, one of the more dramatic symptoms of this contamination is these fish kill events, which have increased in both intensity and frequency in the karst region over the past 8 years. So the most recent was this past summer in Rush Creek, where over 2,500 fish were killed in a prize trout stream. And this was the 4th major fish kill in the Winona County area since 2015. So this takes me to another bill that I will just quickly mention here that we are supportive of this session. This is Senate File 68. The Senate author is McEwen, and House File 81, which is the bill author is Representative Jordan. So the idea behind this protocol is it is an interagency mandate to develop a comprehensive protocol for fish kill events that responds to both public health and environmental concerns. Because as Representative Fischer already discussed, both private wells and municipal water supplies across the state largely draw from underground aquifers. So when those are contaminated, public health is at risk. And we can't ignore that in our fish kill response. So this bill has specific provisions to ensure that the protocol responds to community concerns and strengthens the overall fish kill response in Minnesota. I'm happy to talk about those in more detail if people want to. But it also, a really key piece here is that it addresses the inadequacy of the current fish kill response from a public health perspective. So it includes a directive that the protocol must include a communications plan with a health risk assessment to notify potentially impacted downstream users of the surface water where a fish kill occurred of the potential hazards, as well as those in the vicinity whose public or private water supply may be impacted. And then it also directs, at least the Senate file, also directs the relevant agencies to submit recommendations to the legislature at the start of next session for relevant areas of rules and laws, such as the feedlot rules, which are administered under the Pollution Control Agency, that should be amended to address the actual sources of contamination, which largely stem from agricultural land management practices, to actually prevent fish kill events in the future. So we not only want to have a stronger response when a fish kill event does occur through this protocol, we also want to actually prevent these types of events in the future. Another issue I want to touch on is groundwater sustainability. So, you know, we all know that Minnesota is heralded as the land of 10,000 lakes and is prized for its surface water resources. However, it is groundwater in underground aquifers that comes out of the kitchen tap for 3 out of 4 Minnesotans. And also that supplies 90% of water needs for agricultural irrigation across the state. We know that climate change has already made droughts more frequent and severe. So this is a drought monitor capture from August 2021. And as was recently covered in an article that many of you may have read in the Star Tribune, in the 2022 drought, nearly 800 Minnesota farmers collectively pumped 6.5 billion gallons of water more than their permits allowed. These are would be their water appropriation permits from the Department of Natural Resources, which is enough to supply approximately 180,000 Minnesotans with water for an entire year. But DNR has admitted that these permit violators, nearly a quarter of them were farms operated by R.D. Offutt, which is a large potato grower, are unlikely to face any fines or other consequences. So that leads me to mention another bill here. This is House File 1873. Kozlowski is the author, which seeks to strengthen the DNR's enforcement authority to more closely mirror the enforcement authority that other agencies like the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency already have. So it would give the DNR the explicit authority to conduct investigations and assess administrative penalties for repeated or egregious violations. So we feel at MCEA that these are reasonable and practical powers, which will help the DNR stop permit violations and protect the water allocation priorities of the state. And the last one I want to touch on here, which has also already come up, is PFAS, which is a known carcinogen and the toxic chemical contaminant of our time. So PFAS refers to a class of industrial chemicals known as forever chemicals, and they're water soluble and they bioaccumulate in animals and humans. So they have become ubiquitous and are very hard to remediate once they are in the environment. Also, the origins of this chemical can be traced right here to Minnesota. So the Maplewood-based company 3M was one of the first companies to manufacture and use PFAS in the world and has known of its severe human health impacts for decades. Therefore, we have a special responsibility here in Minnesota to address the problem. which leads me to the final bills I will mention here, and then I promise I will stop talking and open up for discussion. So these are bills for mandatory disclosure and a non-essential, the phased elimination of non-essential uses of PFAS. So I'll just briefly touch on the first here, House File 372 and Senate File 450, which would require manufacturers to disclose intentionally added PFAS in their products for sale in Minnesota. And this is really important because it will provide critical information to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to better understand what PFAS compounds enter the state so that we can improve our state response to what has really reached a crisis with PFAS contamination in the environment. So with that, I will go ahead and close my comments here, but I'm happy to talk about any of these in more detail.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Say, I've got some questions coming in, if that would be okay.
Sure.
That's why we're here.
All right. Okay. So the first one that came in, this one that actually came in prior to tonight's forum, is what is the potential role of Senate File 2330 and House File 2193, which is the 50-year Clean Water Plan, to protect Minnesota's aquifers from large-scale commercial exploitation? I don't know which one of our panelist speakers wants to address that, but don't be shy, just jump on in.
Is this the one introduced by Representative Feist and Senator Morrison?
I believe so. Let's
Yes,
look it up.
yes, I think that's correct.
I have some views, but I'll let Peter go first. He wants to. Or I know it's getting a hearing in both houses, or it's gotten one in the Senate and not in the House.
Yeah, could you repeat the question one more time? I'm because what I do is as I'm hearing the bill numbers, I'm calling them up here because there's so many different bills. It's the only way I can make sure I'm tracking the right thing. So the question again is,
it's the 50-year Clean Water Plan scope of work. And yeah, the primary sponsor in the Senate is Senator Morrison. And the question is, and the House file is 2193. I think it's also titled the 50-year Clean Water Plan. So what's the potential role of it to protect Minnesota aquifers from large-scale commercial exploitation?
I would say that some of the primary roles that it is doing is, first of all, trying to get the data and collect the information that we need to try to figure out how do we put together a roadmap so that 50 years from now, we will have accomplished moving in this direction. And this is going to require a lot of input from, part of it will be the University of Minnesota. They have a number of programs out there that work in the water resource area. In addition, with the agriculture campus out there, they are always looking at different agricultural products that can be grown on the landscape that can help address this problem, that could help address how much nitrogen is needed and also how much the chemicals are needed. And this is one of the things they do a lot of that work on the St. Paul Farm campus, is take a look at new types of either crops that would be grown on the land, or what would be some long-term crops like hazelnuts and those kind of things that can be grown that could have beneficial value to the food chain. And at the same time, besides developing those, putting together the other part is, if you bring new crops out there, new products out there being grown agriculturally, how do you get those into the mainstream system so that they can be sold for a profit that will sustain the farmer? And so they're also linking that. So that's a link that the university is working on. And it's also making sure that they're talking to the different leaders in the different areas to figure out, how do we put this together? This is something that's going to take a lot of work, and it's probably one that's going to have to be built out into a larger scope than it is not as it is right now. So I'll pause at that point and let some of the other folks comment.
You know, I have looked at this bill a little bit when it came out in a previous version. And perhaps I'm just captured in the bureaucracy now that I inhabit, but you know, we have plans upon plans upon plans. They're usually at the very local level, either a drinking water source protection plan around a wellhead area, or one of the 80 major watersheds. They all have, or soon will have, comprehensive watershed management plans. So they all have deadlines and timelines listing when certain activities will be done by a certain date. Having been a legislator, though, I can see how all those plans upon plans may leave people dissatisfied, because it doesn't really answer the big questions, which scientists are often loath to describe, because they are very focused on whatever the data says. And that's the big strategic question, like, you know, what's the mass water balance of all our water underground in Minnesota, which is, we know more than we did 10, 15 years ago, but we don't know exactly how much is there. We have ways to kind of check, but we don't know exactly how much there is. We also don't know if we can guarantee safety of our water, say in 50 years, just because something 40 years from now might come up that we don't know what it is. So I know a lot of people who would be hesitant to guarantee things, but they talk about language like reducing risk. Like, you know, we can definitely, by say 2034, when the Clean Water Fund expires, reduce the risk to the maximum possible extent of contamination of groundwater or surface waters, or at least we can diagnose better. You know, on the issue of corporate exploitation, so I helped, full disclosure, advise a corporate exploiter about a water company that had a very progressive position on recycling, by the way. They were trying to regulate all of their peers as well as them to pay for the cost of recycling, which is now 10 years later that all everybody's talking about. But I didn't really see Minnesota as an enticing place for companies like that to do business, because you do have to pay fees when you drill in there, and we actually keep an eye on things, and we also prioritize drinking water, not industrial use, much higher because of the Groundwater Protection Act of Minnesota. Arizona, California, they don't have that. So people are using irrigation for agriculture while cities are worried about the drinking water supply. You know, in terms of that facility, though, in Elko New Market, which is, I think, what people are asking about, you know, from what the DNR is saying, that they've studied that watershed quite a bit, but they also indicated that the total amount of public water used by this operation would equal that of a, you know, what's being used in a suburb next door. It does bring up the big question about how we use water, though. I think you'd find bipartisan interest with. I would go out there with the bulldozers and chain myself if any idiot from Arizona wanted to put a pipeline to Minnesota or a water train. I think we'd have unanimous votes to prohibit that if the right opportunity existed. I just think I'm a liberal person, but I'm a conservative on that issue. And I'd say, live within your means, get out of the desert. Anyway, that's a rambling question, but I'll be curious to see if those bills that were mentioned end up in an omnibus policy or finance bill. That's kind of what we're all waiting for, as committees come up with their budget targets and they figure out what they can afford. And some ideas may stay in the mix and some may not. The surplus we have, though, is the best opportunity to build back better, or with infrastructure, or plan or do science and the rest. So,
Paul, if I could respond to that a bit, here we don't have much. We don't have the institutions to really manage groundwater as well as it will be need. We need to manage it, at least in the future. First of all, I agree very much with the idea that plans, the best laid plans of anyway. Mice and men are gang after glee. We've seen that across the country in long-term plans, Chesapeake Bay, Lake Okeechobee, cleanup, all this sort of thing. You have to have an institution to do it. And having lived in Arizona, And by the way, I'll preface that by saying there's no way we should be sending water to Arizona. They'll just use it more. But they did organize at about 1980 when they had a severe depletion of groundwater. They had drawn water down more than 100 feet in some places. And they formed an Arizona Groundwater Act. And it, for the areas, the more populated areas and the agricultural areas, they have these groundwater management areas. So now if you want to put up a new subdivision or a new golf course or hell, a new farm, you have to show that you have a 100-year assured supply of water. And they measure every, their ADW, Arizona Department of Water Resources, measures all the water that's pumped. You have to report everything that you pump, where you use it, how it's discharged. Somebody else can use your wastewater. Usually you have to pay for it. But it's every drop is really managed. And that's worked reasonably well. I'm not sure how well it's working right now, but it has controlled the very wasteful use of water to some extent. For example, you rarely see new houses. I'd say you never see new houses with big green lawns anymore. You just can't do it. So that's on one extreme. But I think we might have to get there, at least in steps. You know, some of these areas like Buffalo, Peter, help me out here. Buffalo River, Buffalo. Yeah, we're doing this. We're sort of experimenting with this on a small scale, but as we move into the future, I think we're going to have to do something like that. Maybe not quite as intense as what Arizona does.
I will say, as a state employee, I have observed other state employees saying, well, this is what the statute says. And that's kind of it. And I discovered that state employees aren't supposed to be in the business of saying, well, if you really want to do something about this, do that. You have to have a governor to sign off on that. But, you know, we do have a lot of science about our groundwater. We're seeing more 3D analysis with these geologic atlases and groundwater atlases, funded also by the lottery and the Clean Water Fund and some other sources. The question is, what do you do with it? If you really have a lot of information, you've got to figure out what your strategy is for managing that, and that rises to a pay grade certainly above mine. I did want to add, though, in the corporate exploitation question, there are some things that my science friends will make determinations about, but then leave the average person unsatisfied because there's an issue of economic justice. So, where, for example, when the judge about White Bear Lake said, well, everyone has to stop pumping in a 5-mile radius around White Bear Lake when it reaches a certain level. And I thought, that's great, because all of these people in Lino Lakes that I used to represent in Shoreview, they have these sprinkler systems, and that just boiled me for no rational reason other than it just upset me that these people were wasting water. And we have cities like Blaine that require all new housing to have in-ground sprinkler systems. But it might be sort of sustainable in some strange way if you do it a certain way, but it's not satisfying. And we also see this in agriculture, where we help support farmers to do things that if they did it on their own, they'd probably make money anyway, but they need some sort of a push. And we provide money through the Vet Council for irrigation controllers, so cities can get grants to help subsidize the upgrading your irrigation controllers, so that you can stop wasting tens of thousands of gallons a year, and you get a moisture sensor. You know, they could do it themselves and make their money back within a year or two, but it's just like anything in sales, they won't do it unless you give them an incentive. That it's the money doesn't matter, it's the lure, you know.
And I just want to say, Carly has her hand raised. I think our Chair Emeritus Vita Conitz also had something to add into this. So we'll start with Carly.
Thank you. I just have a couple comments to this question, this topic. I mean, I think that, to your point, Larry, there is increasingly a recognition that even in water-rich upper Midwest states, we need to think about groundwater governance as we deal with climate change, as we deal with increased pressure from population growth, as we deal with increased demand for agricultural irrigation. And I think that the drought of 2022 really drove that point home. And I want to point to a study that Dr. Carrie Jennings at Freshwater recently co-authored on models of groundwater governance across 6 states in the upper Midwest, Minnesota included. So you can find that on the Freshwater website. I don't have the link at hand, but a couple of issues rose to the surface in that comparative study across 6 states in the upper Midwest. One of them was the need for more public transparency. And I will say that here in Minnesota, we do not have any public notice and comment period for water appropriation permits. So this is an area that MCEA is interested to advocate for change, over this legislative session, this 2-year session. I would also say that the study points to the need for more plans at the local aquifer level. So for example, with the Elko New Market example, if there was a local water task force that included, Scott and Dakota County and the Shakopee Sioux community that could plan together, the South Metro region has faced a lot of pressure from rapid population growth. So there's the need for groups to plan for counties and tribal nations to plan at that local aquifer level, so that individual municipalities aren't incentivized to, as in the case of Elko New Market, modify their water appropriation permit through an industrial use to try to get an edge on a larger share of the water. We need to disincentivize that kind of practice. So I think that, that studies like that one are helpful, but I do think we know some of the issues when it comes to groundwater governance. Public, transparency is an easy one to point to right now, that we can start to, that we don't need more plans to identify and to push for change.
As someone who grew up in the desert as well, went through this whole, worked for Las Vegas Valley Water District, Southern Nevada Water Authority, back in the 90s and early 2000s when we were reallocating the Colorado River. Yeah, we didn't have a notice and comment period either. It was just kind of done unilaterally, but it needed to be. We actually had water police come out and citing people for watering their lawns after 7 a.m. and things like that. I don't know if Vito wants to contribute something real quick, Larry.
Yeah, I was going to call. Yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate Carly's comments. And I just want to say, as someone who lives in Elko New Market, in the New Market Township, it doesn't help very much when the DNR tells us, well, the suburbs, Lakeville's using a whole lot more than this project would. Lakeville has over 50,000 people. The population of Elko New Market, the city, is over just around 4,000. So yeah, they're using more. We need to prioritize domestic use. That's what state statute says. So why the heck are we letting an industry from California come mine our groundwater? And neighbors of it are on this call, Janelle Kuznia, where, she's going to have to listen to 110 trucks, diesel trucks go by every day. There's a whole lot of impacts out here that I don't think we have time for tonight, but I would just echo what Carly said, is that we need a regional approach. We need a voice here. Right now, we don't feel like we have one. The DNR is not speaking for us. We're hoping they're going to require a multi-aquifer test to actually see, is my well going to go dry? Is this going to impact the trout stream? That maybe it's not a trout stream here in Elko, but it's the headwaters to the trout stream. It's the farmers need those surface waters so that they have water for their fields. There's many issues here that need a closer look, and we are really calling for that test and for better regulation from above to help us. Thank you.
And Peter, I want to get to you. I see you've had your hand up for a while here. Sorry.
No, thank you. And right to this issue, it is complicated out there. First of all, there's two things going on with example, what's happening in Elko New Market. We've had similar situations happen in other parts of the state where large amounts of water are being used and pumped out. An example is up in Cold Spring. They've got a brewery up there that ships most of their stuff out of state. They're already using, they have a well interference problem that's impacting a trout stream up there. So they're being forced to relocate their wells. But we do have a number of situations right now, is when you think about all the example, Coke, Pepsi, all those products are bottled here in the state, and they use our water, and a lot of that is shipped out. Another big one is beer. We've had a number of breweries. A lot of their products are shipped out of state. So we're kind of in a slippery slope when you're taking a look at what our priorities are when they're allocating permits out there. And as you mentioned, the number one priority is in domestic water. We have to relook at how do we define domestic water, because right now, up in the White Bear Lake area, when the DNR was saying they might cut out people, the only places they were just going to have the domestic users would be able to have water if the DNR had carried out their plan, which means you would have closed hospitals, schools, all daycare operations, besides regular businesses. All those would have ceased to function, because we have hospitals in that region, we've got daycares, we've got schools, all those kind of things would all of a sudden have to close down. Every business would close down because of the priority system. And so one of the things we have to look at, the priority system, which we've never used, we've never enforced, should we be looking at redefining the domestic, so at least it covers hospitals, nursing homes, childcare, and schools. These are some of the problems that we're taking a look at, because the priority system, when it was developed, has great programs, had great thoughts in mind of trying to make it easier as who gets the water. But when you start actually implementing it, there are some big holes out there, because I don't think somebody would want to close down all the schools and the hospitals in the East Metro. And that's what was being proposed by the DNR. So these are some of the things that we have to come back in and try to address. And part of the problem comes in is that in some of these areas, the DNR is kind of like the fox guarding the hen house. They are responsible for making sure in northern Minnesota mining occurs. But when you take a look at the mining and the water resource nature up there, they're putting the issues of making sure we are having mining occurring, it feels like, instead of protecting the groundwater, which also goes into the MPA has a role in it, the Department of Health. And so do we eventually need to take a look at water being done by one larger agency instead of fractionalized as it is now? Because what happens is when it gets fractionalized, you get two different agencies coming at it from two different ways, and somebody has to make a decision. No decision gets made, and so we end up with some of the messes we have, not going any further because of that. And these are some of the problems that we're trying to address. At how do we address that going forward? And when you take a look, and I see the comment on there about the feedlots and the dairies, yes, they do huge amounts, not only demand on the groundwater, but the amount of sludge and manure that comes out. How does that get treated and addressed in the process? And this is going to probably become a bigger problem going forward, because as you have the water challenges out in California and out west, a lot of the more intensive uses of agriculture are going to start looking at coming back to the water-rich regions. And how do we do that to manage in a way that is not only sustainable for the use of the groundwater we have and the surface water, but also in a way that the byproducts that are produced are managed in a responsible manner.
In the parts of northern Nevada that actually have some groundwater, they're doing stupid things like growing alfalfa, which requires flooding fields, so the little bit of groundwater that is out there is just getting wasted. So having said that, I'm going to move on to our next questions from John Wells. Kind of wrapping back to what Representative Fischer said pretty early on in our forum here. And because we tend to be so reactive as a society, we often forget to establish that roadmap that you mentioned, Representative Fischer. So what are our clean water and water use roadmaps, excuse me, so that we've got purposeful management taking us to zero non-conforming waters and zero over-appropriated systems, even given our changing climate in 25 years, when and if the legacy goes away?
I would say that some of the things that we've done over the past 10 years is going to one watershed plan, which is responsible for going in and putting together plans for how do we move in each smaller watershed of addressing these issues and taking a look at it on a holistic manner. So that means they take a look at what the geological atlases that are done out there. They're taking a look at what's happening on the surface water and what's happening on the groundwater and the aquifers, and figuring out how do these things interact, and then what are the major contributors to the problems that are occurring out there, and then trying to figure out how do we manage that going forward. I know that in the agriculture area, they've got a program where farmers are able to get certified as being responsible in their uses of water. This is one of the things that is part of that. The other part is recognizing that we are going to have continued funding going forward to address a number of issues, because many of them that we're facing are legacy issues. And when I say legacy, these are issues that were created years, decades ago, and we're going to have to clean up. And a perfect example is the water contamination. While we have the PFAS issue in the East Metro, in the city of Minneapolis, you've had so much industrialization of TCE, PFAS. You've got asbestos in certain areas. Most of their upper aquifers are so contaminated that they are not able to find a sustainable groundwater use to supplement their river water. And so we've got a lot of work that has to be done to help clean up the sites out there. Those are some of the things that we also have to take a look at. Changing agriculture practices is trying to move so much from the intensive row crops to crops that don't need as much of pesticides, don't need as much as nitrogen, and create more ground cover on a year-round basis. And these are the type of things that are being done. In some areas are being done in voluntary efforts. Others are being done as we're seeing changes in the climate, is people and even conservative representatives saying we need to do more to help hold water back on the land. How do we start doing that? And focusing, say, in the Minnesota River Basin, is where people are realizing that with the intensity of the rainfalls, we have to figure out new ways to help slow down the water coming off. And as you do that, that starts making sure that things settle out of the water before it gets down into the Minnesota River itself, which then flows into the Mississippi River. So I'll stop there. This is just a fraction of things that can be done.
Thank you so much, Representative Fischer. I wonder if Carly has something to add to this.
Yeah, so I think that in terms of the roadmaps that we do have, we've been really lucky to have the clean water dollars to fund the watershed restoration and protection strategies, and the way those translate to one watershed, one plan. We really need to make sure, though, that the aspirational goals in those documents are reflected on the ground. So let me give you a specific example. The total maximum daily load for total suspended solids, so largely sedimentations, dirt in the water, for the lower Minnesota River and the Blue Earth River, have an 83% reduction goal for sediment to get those waters to meet the water quality standards for total suspended solids. But we continue to see new drainage system improvements, sent through and funded by local drainage authorities. So we need to make sure that the actual goals that are in our one watershed, one plans are reflected in, for example, local drainage authority decisions. Because, there are multiple one watershed, one plan that identify altered hydrology as a source of water quality impairments, but then continue to green light drainage system improvements. That's one thing I would point to. Another example, I think we're really at the edge of this groundwater sustainability issue, and it's going to be the focus of a lot of attention as we go forward, because the 2022 drought just made it. We couldn't avoid the reality that we're in anymore. But for example, we have a groundwater sustainability standard. It's in 103G. I believe it's 271, but it's written in very broad language that's hard to actually operationalize in individual permit decisions for water appropriation permits from the DNR. So that's another example where we need to make sure that the aspirational goals that we have in our groundwater sustainability standard and statute, or in our one watershed, one plans and our total maximum daily loads, are reflected in actual permit decisions on the ground. So water appropriation permits, drainage decisions, etc.
Thank you. And I have a question coming in from Aaron Zellhofer. So there's been a lot of talk about ag and nitrates this evening. And are there any bills out there right now that specifically address that?
You said nitrates.
Nitrates, yeah.
Well, this is one area where I think that movement on the nitrate water quality standard would be really helpful. That came out of the legislature as a mandate to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency over a decade ago now. But in terms of bills this session, I think that the drainage registry bill doesn't tackle the nitrate issue. It's more of a transparency bill around the need to have statewide notice on new petition drainage projects. But we also know that drainage systems are the primary pathway for the delivery of nitrate to our surface waters. So this is part of the recognition that these drainage systems impact watersheds across the state. So notice has to go to a much broader public than just the immediate benefited landowners and the immediate jurisdiction of the local drainage authority. So I think that's one bill that starts to get at the public process issues around the nitrate problem. And then the fish kills bill also seeks to, if we can get a rapid response team on the ground when a fish kill event happens. So the protocol would be you have to identify a rapid response team that can get there in 24 to 48 hours of a fish kill. That would really help pinpoint sources of contamination so that we can start to, for example, enforce violations, permit violations, if there are, feedlots that violate the terms of their permit or their manure management plan, that kind of thing. So those are two bills that get at the issue through kind of from different angles, but I think that that's one area where we are going to need a lot more work.
There's certainly a lot of things being proposed for funding to get at nitrates. That includes everything from more money for the Forever Green Initiative at the University of Minnesota for perennials like intermediate wheatgrass or kernza that can be a cash crop for farmers and armor the soil year round. There's a considerable amount of money being pushed by Christy Purcell from Northfield, who is just great. A lot of us are familiar with her work and watershed work in Rice County. There's more money being proposed for proposing more soil health practices. There's a University of Minnesota working group on soil health. The idea here is you increase the porosity and the organic content of soil and agriculture to allow water to infiltrate. There's more porous soil, tends to get water to go this way and not that way. And then when you armor the soil and cover things like with cover crops, you reduce the need for herbicides and fertilizer in the first place. So it meets several things. It also makes your crops more able to withstand heavy rains that you expect from climate change. So I think that is the argument some agencies are making. I think that they can probably get at more results quicker, at least in agriculture, with that approach. But that work is slow. I'm not going to joke around here. I am enthusiastic, though. Every year that goes by, more farmers are trying new things that are better for water quality. And I don't mean to sound ageist here, but there are people who learned farming and that chemicals are your friends. That generation is starting to exit farming as they age out. And so people who are taking a longer term perspective than just the next couple of years or thinking about the next couple of decades are now coming into farming, and they have a greater depth of ecological knowledge than before. So in that sense, time is on our side. But oh man, Carly can attest to this. I mean, there are squeaky wheels out there representing some sectors in agriculture who give you the impression that everything is fine. Like that meme where the guy's sitting there and everything's fine and there's flames everywhere. But the more farmers that I talk to individually, the more diversity of opinion I find, and the more willingness to innovate and to make more money, which is what soil health and water quality techniques will do. So there's just a lot of receptiveness, but man, it is slow because it's just like campaigning, which I'm sure all of you have done when you're doing phone banking or door knocking. There are just some people who are not engaged because they're thinking about other things, or you think it could be in your direction and you need to do something to seal the deal to get them to commit to doing something. So we have lots of people who are ones and fives. If you're thinking of a persuadable universe here, we need to get the twos and the threes for sure into our camp and using more soil health techniques. But with 59,000 farms, it is slow, and we have a lot of rented land too. We're trying to reach out to people who rent their land out. It's more time consuming to get those practices done on rented land, because you have to get the agreement of the renter and the owner, or get them to agree what they're going to do. And a lot of women own farmland, by the way. A lot of them are farmers, but I see more and more information from the University of Minnesota about how women are looking for transition planning to the next generation, or being able to take charge of their situation and tell the, no offense, the old farts at the downtown that they exist and that they should listen to them and be helpful. Sexism has been alive and well in the ag world.
Yeah, just a quick comment to several of these things on agriculture and also urban pollutants, or all pollutants. In the past, we've often relied on treatment at the end of the pipe. That's where the whole, it's an esoteric comment, but Carly mentioned the TMDL concept. And increasingly, we're going to be able to turn to source reduction, reducing the amount of fertilizer you put on the land and by more precise fertilization and things like that, and a lot of other things. We tend to think of the problem after it's created rather than think of the source of these pollutants. And I'll turn this back to Peter. I see his hand here.
Thank you. And one of the things we have to realize too is that not all the problems in agriculture, and the examples I'll use is in the metropolitan area. Over the last few years with climate change, we are seeing more and more instances where our lakes are no longer swimmable. It's not unusual that after a large rainfall, we're finding out that a number of the lakes that have beaches are posting that you cannot swim out there, because what's happening is coming down through the stormwater chain. And one of the things we've never looked at in the metropolitan area or any area that has stormwater is, what is the stormwater doing to contribute to what's going on with the amount of dogs and cats and domestic animals that we have out there, along with wildlife like geese. In some instances, they're finding that the reason some of the lakes are closing down is because so much of the fecal matter coming in is coming in from geese. In other areas, it's a combination of domestic and wildlife. In some areas, it is all domestic. And what happens is this stuff enters into the storm sewers. It starts growing in the hot, humid weather. And then when you get a big rain, it washes out into the lakes that are out there, which also feeds into the Mississippi River. And these are another large source that is becoming a problem, that those of us that are in the suburban, urban environments, we have to start talking to our representatives at our city councils, at the counties, to find out what are they doing to address the issues that come out of our stormwater. And it's not only that, but if you ever watch where the stormwater outlets come into the lakes and the rivers, it's interesting, as soon as you have a large rain, particularly with the intensities we have, how much crap and how quickly the water turns brown as everything flushes out of those things. So we have to think not only what's happening in agriculture, but also what's happening in our own backyard. And sometimes we forget that. And I have found, when I've talked to my Republican colleagues, when I approach it saying, what am I doing in the stormwaters? What are we doing here? I found that they become, instead of defensive, because we're attacking the problem on what's happening in our backyard, they become much more open and willing to talk about what is going on in the agriculture area. And I think it's really important, as we talk about what's happening in agriculture, we recognize what's happening in our own areas, and that helps get the people in the agriculture area to move, and at the same time for us to address the problems that are in our backyards.
I would agree with that 100%, because there's a empathy that develops when you say, yes, we have a problem here in the cities. I have a cascading rain garden out here, and I use rain barrels, and I get close to zero discharge. I'm not quite there, but I mentioned things about people using their lawn sprinklers and using tens of thousands of gallons more than they need to, and neonicotinoid pesticides on our nursery plants. Now, in terms of the scale, it might be different, but once people say, oh, okay, this person isn't just fingering out me, it's helpful. I've also seen it's helpful to talk to conservatives about place-based and income-based assistance there's been some resistance to environmental justice discussion because they don't realize that it also includes income. And when they see maps and realize that there are people living below the requisite income line in rural areas, they're like, oh, okay, I get it. We're all in this together. So yeah, Peter's got it down.
I'm going to have to start winding this down. I can't believe we've been talking for an hour and 20 minutes.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions, if you don't mind me throwing them in, Larry.
Ooh, if they're very quick, I want to about I'll give you my question for the panelists first is, what do you want us to do? How can we best help with all this? But Megan, if there's a couple of quick questions, go ahead and let's see if we can.
Yeah, well, this one, it's kind of a multi-part question, but it's a pretty good one, but it's fairly yes or no-ish, and I'm going to put it in the chat too, so that our guests have it. So it says, with respect, this is from Mike Maleska. With respect to the decades of monitoring, testing, and regulating groundwater and aquifers, wouldn't any forward-looking water legislation be best served by knowing with more precision where the aquifers are replenished from? Percolation from surface water bodies, Rocky Mountain snow melt, seasonal replenishments, as there might be different protection for different sources. I'll put that in the chat real quick too. But once again, it's a lengthy question, but it's really kind of a yes or no answer.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the county geologic atlases and the groundwater atlases that we have as a state are really pretty remarkable. So in that study that I mentioned earlier from Dr. Carrie Jennings at Freshwater, that looked at groundwater governance across 6 states in the upper Midwest, Minnesota had some of the best data on our underground aquifers. And that's because of resources like those geologic atlases that we do have. So I think we're ahead of the curve on the data that we have. And what we need to do is start to make sure that we're actually translating the information we have on our aquifers to our permit decisions. And frankly, that when we don't have enough information on an aquifer in an area of really rapid growth like the South Metro region, that tools that are available, like a multi-aquifer test, are used to assess the impacts of a proposed use on other resources in that aquifer area.
Yep. Okay, now I think I have to close it off. And that, by the way, that's a really excellent observation. That's been, I think, invaluable to guiding future water management. But we're at 7:20. We have 10 minutes. And I think a lot of people didn't go to the Oscars or whatever was on TV, and they came here to hear about water legislation. That's a pretty remarkable level of energy, I think.
I thought you were going to announce the winners.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could, but anyway,
I can tell you there aren't any winners yet. I looked, and there aren't any.
What
yet,
do you want? How can we, in the Environmental Caucus and other people who just joined, how can we help fairly specifically? Let's go backward. I'll start with, since I started with Peter, I'll start with Carly this time. What do you need from us?
Yeah, so I put some specific bills into the PowerPoint that I did earlier, and I'm happy to share that PowerPoint if that's useful. But those are all, bills that are active this session. We do action alerts at MCEA for bills that we support. So if you're on MCEA's email list, you'll get an action alert for bills like that drainage registry bill when we want to encourage, and it sort of has a form. You can either write your own message or it provides a form to contact your legislator and let them know your thoughts on proposed legislation. I also think I've been really impressed since I moved to Minnesota with the coverage of water issues in local media like the Star Tribune and the Minnesota Reformer. There's other issues that have been highlighted that could use attention and public opinion, things like the nitrate water quality standard at the PCA, groundwater sustainability as it relates to specific proposed projects. I would encourage everyone to see MCEA as a resource. If there are, even if we do have limited resources, but we will do what we can to try to provide help on issues as they come up. So I would encourage you to use MCEA as a resource. And in terms of what you all can do this session, some of those specific bills, if any of them really inspire you, I would encourage you to support them.
Yeah. Okay. Paul?
As a state employee, I wouldn't dare suggest advocating to you what you should do. And Carly's really smart. That's all I'll say.
Okay, then Peter.
Yes, I have several things to mention is that, first of all, Carly is putting out some good information, some good links there. What you want to do is take a look at those. And where I would say the big focus right now is on the Senate. The Senate is very timid. They're not up for election in 4 years. And a lot happens between now and 4 years where they should be able to go bold and be assertive out there. And so what we need is to have folks contact their senators and tell them, go ahead and be bold. We're up in 2 years and we're being very bold because the reality comes in 2 years from now, we may not be in charge. And so let's get what we can get done now. And that's what the Senate needs to understand. This is their one shot. 10 years ago, everybody thought, oh yeah, we'll have more time. And what happened? It didn't happen. A lot of good programs did not get rolled out, policies did not get done. So I would say, first of all, encourage your senators to be much more bold on the environment, on the water issues. Number two, if your senators or the people you're working with are Republican, speak Republican to them. You know, kind of what we mentioned earlier is acknowledge where we are and the issues that we're dealing with, to find the common ground that they'll work together. If we come out in our real strong frameworks, they have a tendency of crawling into a shell, and where that hurts us is, say, 2 years from now, if the House flips back to the Senate, because we're flipping every couple of years, that means they're going to be in a shell and they're going to respond in a negative way. If we build the relationships now, talking to them, using language that they feel comfortable with, we increase the likelihood that we're going to get some of these projects done. And the example I'll use is we are having good success in the Republicans recognizing we have to hold water back in the Minnesota River Valley. And a lot of that work was being pushed by Representative Paul Torkelson, who is a Republican. And that just came from work was when I would used to be in our meeting saying, hey, we've got these problems with our stormwater. Here's what we need to do. He came up after and says, you know, we're having some of these problems in the ag area because I didn't attack ag for their crap. He was able to say, hey, let's work together to get something so we can address the issues we're having in the Minnesota River Valley. And so that's why I kind of say that is it sometimes feel good to go to war with the Republicans, but that can hurt us when we want to try to get longer range things done down the road. It's trying to build that path forward to bring them along with us and up to where we are so that we can do the sustainable things that we need for our future generations.
And any comments on talk Republican? That's the first time I've heard that phrase exactly like that. I'll start. We all drink water. You know, Republicans and Democrats, it's drinking water is as bipartisan as it can possibly get. But are there others?
The way I usually do it is a lot of times when I've got issues, I take a look as to how they look in my area. So when I talk about groundwater contamination, I'll usually go with what's happening with PFAS over here or what's happening with the industrial contaminations that we have over in Minneapolis and saying, hey, we've got to clean these up because it's to the point we don't have enough water for drinking and it's causing a problem out there. And your Republicans who are more of a moderate will start saying, hey, I've got some of these problems in terms of water availability for my local communities, particularly when the communities are raising concerns about wellhead interference, that type of thing. You know, so those are some of the ways that I have found in trying to speak out there. And so it's what it's doing is figuring out where are they at and trying to and meeting them there with their language. It's taking the frameworks that they're working out of and tweak the words so that they aren't quite as caustic that they're using, but are similar to things that they can understand. You know, because when we talk about climate change, they get all worked up. Global warming, they get worked up. But if you talk about you know, the rain intensities, you say, oh, hey, the storms that we're getting are so intense and are so more frequent. They get it. They say, yeah, we've got to start dealing with the problems from it. So that's one example of how I convert instead of saying global climate change, global warming, that kind of stuff. I take a look at real specifics that they can relate to and get them to understand how that framework, and then they start moving along and say, yeah, we need to start addressing some of this.
People will surprise you, and I think if you say something that they didn't expect from you, if you say they will be surprised. And it always helps to know a little bit about the issues as they're facing them. Or I've gone into southern states to talk about recycling and when that field, and I talked about the economics and how manufacturers need raw materials. We never mentioned climate, never mentioned any of that stuff. They just said, oh, okay, so government isn't doing everything it could. Well, I like hearing that. I mean, there's different ways to approach it, but understanding, place-based issues to show that you understand what's going on in that area really helps.
John Wilson, you have your hand up, yeah.
Yeah, I had my example is I was at a hearing about 20 years ago when I was working for EQB and on climate change, and the Center for the American Experiment had given a dated BS commentary about climate change, and somebody else came up right after that. I was from Sierra Club or someplace like that, and mentioned the ice out date and how that had gone from like mid-March in International Falls to late February. And the chair of the committee was Bob Lassard, who was a Democrat, quote unquote Democrat, but about as close to Republican as you could get. And he was a fishing guide, and he knew that resonated with him because it affected his livelihood. And he saw it too. He could see, oh, that's climate change, making the ice come out so much earlier, 2 or 3 weeks earlier. This is 20 years ago. I don't know what it's doing today, but that's one example, I think.
Yeah, first week of May. It used to be a little bit later. We'd be lucky to have it open for fishing opener, which is Mother's Day weekend, but now it's last week of April, first week of May up here.
Okay.
John, I think maybe to add to that, using historic data, at least on climate change, we've seen enough in the past 30 years or so that you don't have to talk about forecasts or predictions. You can talk about what has happened, like the longer lake freezing, or shorter lake freezing. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Other gems at the last minute here? I think we've done pretty good. We're right at 7:30, and I'd like to thank the panelists, Paul and Carolyn and Jim. Feel free to contact if you want to send something to the whole DFL Environmental Caucus, do it. Probably send it to, if it's an email, send it to Megan, I guess, or Greg. And probably some of us will be in contact with you. You've certainly given us some good things to think about.